Since Claudio was a baby, he had pneumonia as often as 4 or 5 times a year. It almost always starts with a sudden rise of temperature. Typically, he stays perfectly normal just moments before he has a sudden epileptic seizure. Usually, there are some signs before Claudio has his seizures. If there's no sign, then we suspect that he has some acute condition. If the temperature is above 38 degrees, then we would take him to hospital. They ran some tests, including a chest X-ray, but his lungs stayed clear in the beginning. So they sent him home asking us to observe him. But on most such occasions, Claudio's temperature stays high. Then we take him back to the hospital. And eventually he is admitted as an inpatient. And almost always he is diagnosed with pneumonia during his hospital stay. Claudio typically has a feverish seizure when his temperature has just started to rise. So at that point, his chest X-ray wouldn't show any signs of pneumonia, although his blood test indicates high CRP, which means there's some kind of inflammation in his body. After Claudio experiences from a few days to a week of continuous high temperature, the X-ray eventually starts to show some inflammation in his lungs. And it takes up to a week before doctors can make diagnosis. And it's like that every time he has a seizure followed by a sudden high temperature. It takes a long time to get a diagnosis. Usually, doctors won't start treatments for pneumonia unless the chest X-ray confirms the symptoms. So Claudio ends up suffering from high temperature for a while. One of the reasons is the problem with overusing antibiotics, the crucial parts of the treatments for pneumonia. Most doctors are cautious about overusing antibiotics. I've lived in Japan, the United States, and Australia. What I found interesting is that the doctors from every one of these countries claim that they use antibiotics more than others. An American doctor would say, "We use antibiotics way more than the rest of the world." A Japanese doctor would say, "Japan is the worst when it comes to the overuse of antibiotics." Then an Australian doctor would say, "We prescribe antibiotics the most per capita." Well, there's a strange competition going on here. I bet none of the claims are based on real data. One thing for sure is that the doctors are concerned about the overuse of antibiotics in each of those 3 countries. Antibiotics are very effective against bacterial infections, but there's one downside. When antibiotic medication is prescribed, the patient is told to take all of the dosage even they don't have any symptoms. If you stop taking it before the end of the prescribed period, the bacteria may remain in your body. Even worse, the bacteria may develop resistance to the medication. When people are infected by resistant bacteria, they can't be treated with the same medication. Some bacteria develop resistance to most of medications, and they can be a great threat to the entire population. And that's why doctors try to minimize the use of antibiotics. For that reason, the doctors were reluctant to give Claudio antibiotics until his pneumonia is confirmed by the X-ray. But after Claudio had so many similar episodes, the doctors finally started treating him with antibiotics right after the initial rise of the temperature. Because by that time, they were sure that Claudio's symptoms would develop into pneumonia. We call it preemptive antibiotics, and it's been quite effective for Claudio's treatment, because he wouldn't have to suffer from the symptoms for a long time. It started in Australia, and thankfully his Japanese doctors agreed to follow the same method. Now, as to why Claudio has pneumonia so often, we didn't know the reasons for a long time until we came back to Japan when Claudio was 9 years old. We simply thought because of his disability, he's more frail and prone to all the infections that are not a huge problem for all other healthy kids. Then, after we moved to Japan, one day his Japanese doctor said, "Well, it's probably the aspiration." Aspiration, as a medical term, means inhaling something, typically saliva or food, into one's airways. Disabled people who have poor ability to expel it by coughing tend to develop pneumonia. It kind of made sense to me because when Claudio has cold or flu, he would have sneezing or coughing because his upper respiratory system is infected first before it spreads into his lower respiratory system and finally spreads into lungs to develop pneumonia. But in case of an aspiration, he stays well without those symptoms before he has a sudden high temperature. Then it takes a few days for pneumonia to develop, but he doesn't necessarily have any symptoms of cold. If the infection occurs directly in his lungs by aspiration, then it makes sense that his upper respiratory system remains unaffected. It's not caused by airborne viruses, but something happening in his own body. And since he has very weak ability to expel it, he won't cough much. His temperature starts to go up at the time he aspires his saliva, and the inflammation spreads into his lungs gradually thereafter. That's probably the reason as to why his X-ray doesn't show any signs of pneumonia for a few days. So finally, I came to understand the whole mechanism of Claudio's frequent pneumonia. Claudio still gets pneumonia from time to time, but not as often as he did in his childhood. He's a fully grown man now, and he has more resistance to infections now.
チャンネル登録、高評価よろしくお願いします。